Hello, and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 15th Sunday after Pentecost, when our Gospel reading is written in Luke's Gospel, chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone down to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I give to the poor. And if I defraud anyone of anything, I pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This dramatic passage and encounter between Jesus and Zacchaeus comes right near the end of what is known in Luke's Gospel as the travel narrative. It began back in chapter 9, verse 51, when Jesus set his face to go up to Jerusalem. And it ends in chapter 19:27, after the next story in this chapter. And after that, it says, after he had said these things, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So between he set his face to go to Jerusalem and now he goes up to Jerusalem in 19 verse 28, this intermediate section of about 10 chapters is known as the travel narrative, because repeatedly we hear that Jesus went on from there, or he entered a village, or he came to a certain place, and it's not always clear exactly what the itinerary is, except that Jesus is in some way moving toward his fateful last week in Jerusalem. But as part of this travel narrative, we hear now in the beginning of this story that Jesus came to Jericho and was passing through it. And this story about Zacchaeus addresses many of the themes that have been developed throughout the travel narrative. If we look back just at chapter 18 and the stories that are there, we see a number of different themes. For example, God gives justice to those who appeal to God, even though earthly judges may have to be pestered about justice. God gives justice to those who appeal to God. The self-righteous, like one who vaunts his own innocence before God and takes pride in not being like a poor person next to them in the temple, that kind of self-righteousness offends God, is a second theme. People bring little children to see Jesus, and the disciples would keep them away, but Jesus says, "Let them come, because little people count." That's yet another theme. The wealthy cannot save themselves, Jesus says clearly. With God, all things are possible, but it's harder for a wealthy person to enter the kingdom than almost anything else if they try to save themselves. And in the final story of chapter 18, a blind man knows that it is Jesus, son of David, who is passing by. Even the blind can see who Jesus is when they look with the eyes of faith. All of these are themes that cluster in chapter 18 and that have been developed much more fully in repeated stories throughout the 10, 11 chapters of this travel narrative. And so now we come to the story of Zacchaeus, that wee little man. Oh, a wee little man was he, if you know the song. He's first described, though, as a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Well, strike two. A tax collector, one who collaborates with the Roman occupation, that raises doubts and suspicions right away. And in Luke's gospel, there are few things more difficult, more challenging, more not quite disqualifying, but more of an obstacle than being rich. Yikes. Caution about this Zacchaeus, we think, after we've read that he is a chief tax collector and rich. And yet, if we pay attention relative to the themes that Luke has already set out, Zacchaeus knows to seek out Jesus. He goes to see who Jesus is. He's curious. He doesn't know like the blind man did, but he knows enough to make sure that he goes to see who Jesus is. And being little, he's hindered by the crowd. That means that Jesus will care about him and look out for this little person. But even more so, Zacchaeus shows his own initiative, his own gumption, by overcoming his small stature and climbing up a tree to make sure that he can see who Jesus is. He is persistent, like the person who knocks on the door of the unjust judge until finally someone answers. So too Zacchaeus is persistent. And when he comes down, he opens his home and receives Jesus with joy. Jesus, the itinerant prophet of God, seeking a place to lay his head, and Zacchaeus receives him with joy. Zacchaeus is judged by the self-righteous, because all those who watched this scoffed at Jesus and grumbled, saying that he was going to stay at the home of a sinner, a tax collector. Zacchaeus is judged by the self-righteous the same way that the poor man in the temple was judged by the self-righteous person next to him. But Zacchaeus does not try to justify himself. Rather, he appeals to Jesus. Zacchaeus stood there and said to Jesus, "Look, half of everything I have I give to the poor. If I defraud anyone, I restore it fourfold." Those are standards that are suggested, or in one case, expected, if you're a child of Abraham, if you're an Israelite, if you live according to the Torah. And this seems to be not a moment of repentance, a moment of commitment, a sudden coming to the realization, this is what I should do. Zacchaeus simply states this as, this is what I do, and appeals to Jesus with that simple fact. And Jesus responds with a summary statement. This is a child of Abraham, one who knows to seek God's presence, one who is little in the eyes of the world and hindered from coming, but Jesus welcomes, one who is persistent about appealing to God, one who receives Jesus as God's messenger with joy, one who may be judged by the self-righteous, but who does not indulge in self-righteous defense, rather simply just presents oneself to Jesus with the simple facts of living the Torah lifestyle, living as one of God's people. Wealth turns out not to be the problem. We were warned at the beginning, a tax collector and he's rich, watch out. But every one of these elements of the story demonstrates that Zacchaeus does not rely on himself, trust in himself, justify himself. He trusts in God and appeals to Jesus and welcomes Jesus. It is not wealth that is the problem. It is the pride or the sense of self-sufficiency or the blindness to one's need for and dependence on God, one's need for God's presence in Jesus that the gospel writer portrays as the problem. But then what does it mean at the end to say that the Son of Man, Jesus, comes to seek out and to save the lost? How is it that Zacchaeus has been lost, if indeed all of these things do not mean he has now been found? Well, when we look through Luke's gospel at where he uses this term lost, we find that back in chapter 15, there's a woman who lost a coin. There's a shepherd who lost a sheep. The wording of this sentence itself in chapter 19, verse 10, echoes very clearly Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 16, where God promises to seek out and to save the lost people of Israel, lost because enemies exiled them. You see, coins and sheep and people don't lose themselves. They are lost because others exclude them. Others lose them along the way, inattentively, not paying attention, or actively exiling and excusing them. These are the people that Jesus has come to seek out and to save. The lost, whom Jesus comes not necessarily to forgive for their sins, that's another theme in the Gospels, but rather when they have been lost to a society that rejects them, Jesus comes to restore them and their dignity and their place before God as one of God's people. God bless.